The Liberal government's controversial Bill C-5 is being debated by the Senate this week and widely expected to become law. Indigenous peoples have been speaking out against the legislation and the speed with which it is being pushed through. But an Indigenous organization that represents businesses and workers in the resource sector sees this moment as an opportunity. For more, we're joined by John Desjarlais, Executive Director of the Indigenous Resource Network. John, thanks so much for taking some time for us here. As you know, there's a lot of opposition to Bill C-5, but you and the Indigenous Resource Network view this as an opportunity. How so?
Absolutely. I think we've seen it as an opportunity because, I think we've seen a lot of good examples of where Indigenous communities, industry, and government have come together in terms of, fully recognizing and including Indigenous rights in terms of either ownership or co-governance, co-regulation. And we want to lean into that and make sure that that actually is kind of the precedent for, kind of moving these forward. We're also engaged kind of on a macro level as well, too, in terms of understanding world economics and opportunities. Being outpaced by developers that don't necessarily produce like we do in Canada or produce like we do with the influence of co-management of Indigenous people. And so, just trying to move lockstep with all these pieces forward and lean into examples where there is trust, there is social license, there is consent, and make sure that's standardized in terms of how we advance these major projects.
There's a lot of concern over what this legislation could mean for treaty rights, environmental approvals, the powers it will give federal ministers to approve projects. Do you share any of those concerns?
Yeah, similar, absolutely. And, I think, and rightfully so, we have a history where, our rights were railroaded for, the international interest development and things like that. Project developers were treating Indigenous people as stakeholders as part of a process. So there's, I think, a lot of this distrust has been earned. But we've also seen some incredible momentum and changes, so many changes, and Truth and Reconciliation surely kicked the door open on a lot of this understanding and reconciling and economic reconciliation, where there's different expectation, there's different understanding. I still have concerns that there's paternalism, that there's not full understanding of what constitutionally protected rights means in terms of ensuring and understanding its impacts, mitigating, removing, or accommodating and justifying. But there's also a greater understanding that, Indigenous people aren't going to bear the environmental and impacts of rights anymore without a meaningful discussion on what that looks like, whether it be on the reward side of project development through, the different ways that they can get involved, or on the risk side and just saying, no, absolutely, this is just too much of an impact to our rights. We don't want to do this. And so, yeah, we just see there's opportunity. There is players, there is people on all sides that want to see this in lockstep, true partnership where, rights are paramount to any development decision and go forward with that. I think we take a position of just being, I think, a little more optimistic, a little more hopeful, and certainly there to kind of advocate and support that it does move in line with, in spirit of good faith, and it does progress, and we are serving the interests of Indigenous people and all Canadians.
Another concern, I guess, John, is that we don't really know what the projects are that we're talking about. The Ring of Fire is one that's often cited, but have you been hearing of some other specific projects out there?
No, I think they're starting to narrow down. And so I think there's a lot of discussion more so on the infrastructure side. So, what is the supporting infrastructure to major development projects? So not necessarily, like the mine or this or that, but I mean a major corridor, or the major, electrification of a corridor or an entryway or major roads or major infrastructure, I think. So there's discussion around that, but what those are specifically, I don't know. I know for us, we want to see Indigenous enrichment and involvement in all of them, and prioritize the ones that advance, I think, Canada's commitments to reconciliation and commitments to Indigenous inclusion, prioritizing those the best we can. But specifically what those are, I think just more recently, they were asked the province to provide their wish lists and figure out what those are and what that process looks like. That's I think frustratingly so for every Canadian. It's like, who gets to say what those are and what are they, right?
Well, it seems like a given that the legislation will pass in the Senate this week. Do you think there's any chance, though, that things like protests and legal action tie up these projects deemed in the national interest?
There certainly is potential. Like I said, those who have not been engaged in good faith, those who have not been, the beneficiary of good engagement or participation, who have not seen that process, I could certainly see mobilizing against that, and which it isn't unfortunate, but I mean that reflects, I think, their reality and their experience, and we're all about self-determination. So if people need to advance that so be it. But I also say that there's incredible opportunity and great examples of where it's worked. I think I think people want to come to the table much more and at the table, and I think Indigenous people, there's a seat for us now. If not sharing that table, there's certainly a seat for us to meaningfully participate. And let's explore that first. Let's exhaust that first before presuming and taking that kind of ideological position that things are out there to kind of hurt us or against us. And let's go in good faith and figure this out. And if it doesn't, let's resort to litigation and go back to building an even deeper jurisprudence against why it's not good policy or not good business to challenge Indigenous people, interests, and our rights.
John, we'll leave it there, but appreciate your perspective and time here today.
Absolutely. My absolute pleasure. Thanks for having us.